Thank you very much indeed, everyone, and welcome back to our second session. We are absolutely thrilled to have you here with us today. My name is Mary Cray, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Living Streets. So we are going to be looking at school streets in general, and we have a stellar lineup of speakers for you this morning. We're particularly to talk about safety, particularly junctions and crossings, people's perception of safety, the very live air pollution issue, congestion at parking and idling outside school gates, the ability of children to walk together in safety, the importance of having uncluttered pavements which are comfortable for people to walk on. And this is a very live issue, especially with COVID and more and more restaurants and businesses encroaching and out on the pavements. And the accessibility piece, space for buggies, space for wheelchair users, and even room for parents to walk with more than one child. So most school streets in Scotland are 20 miles an hour on a part-time basis, thanks to a policy dating back over a decade. But sadly, surrounding neighbourhoods are not, unless you live in certain local authorities like Edinburgh, Glasgow and the Scottish Borders. One of the first school streets closures was piloted in East Lothian in 2012, so long before places like Hackney and other capitals like Cardiff were anywhere near this. So Edinburgh has a long and proud history on this and rolled out its School Streets programme. It was one of the first in 2016, supported by Living Streets through our WOW Walk to School programme. We're delighted that Glasgow is now catching up with Edinburgh with a rapid rollout of School Streets, which Councillor Richardson will talk about. And we've worked with a number of schools in Glasgow focusing on travel planning, but this work sadly has been disrupted by COVID. Moray Council has been a long-standing partner of Living Streets and is showing how school streets can be rolled out in more rural areas too, with a couple of examples from Elgin. And this is obviously incredibly challenging because, as we know, in rural areas, sometimes we don't even have safe footways to walk on. So we've done less in Scotland on play streets, despite data showing that some children in Glasgow face challenges around access to green space. And COVID has really thrown up the very clear issue of lack of outdoor spaces for children and communities in general. So it's important to learn from other parts of the UK. So we have some brilliant speakers today. Councillor Anna Richardson from Glasgow City Council, a video from McDonald, who's the Sustainable Travel Officer for Moray Council in the northeast of Scotland, and Professor Alison Stenning, who co-runs Play Meet Street North Tyneside. So we're going to be hearing from all of those speakers today. So I'd like to begin by introducing Councillor Anna Richardson from Glasgow City Council. She was elected as a councillor for Langside Ward in 2015 and again in 2017. She is currently convener for sustainability and carbon reduction and has a particular interest in transport, equalities and the mainstreaming of sustainability across all council functions. This is a very exciting time to talk about decarbonisation, net zero, and we have the Biden Decarbonisation Summit tomorrow. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Mary. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about our work on school streets in Glasgow, both before and of course during the pandemic. It's not been the easiest time to be implementing new initiatives, but nonetheless we have made significant progress in a relatively short period of time. As was said in Mary's introduction, school streets had not been tried in Glasgow before. Other local authorities had done so in Scotland well ahead of us, and I had been aware of these rollouts and followed them with interest, because traffic around schools has been a perennial problem for us, as it is across Scotland. Council officers and schools have always done a power of work to engage and urge drivers to behave safely around schools, often with the children themselves taking leading roles, such as through speed awareness activity, posters, banners and other campaign materials. Every year, schools select junior road safety officers to work on these issues and to engage with their fellow pupils. All of this work continues, and we're now refreshing the road safety service that we offer to provide a holistic road safety and active travel offering to schools. But it was clear that a stronger approach was also required to send a clear message that the streets outside our schools should prioritise children's safety and well-being above all. So in August 2019, our first 6 pilot schools were introduced. And this happened with surprise ease. There was a lot of publicity and media interest, but almost unanimous public support. and this certainly isn't the usual experience of any measures that reduce traffic and prioritise active travel. Indeed, the biggest criticism I was getting in my inbox was, why were we not coming to other schools and rolling out more widely? And I think there's a really important point here, that bringing in measures that are so obviously positive, that make it safer and cleaner for small children on their way to school, is a really good way in to opening up discussions about our streets with communities and what they should be. And I'll come back to this later. Implementation itself wasn't quite as straightforward, of course, as you'd imagine. We chose to use signage only to delineate the zones, and we rely on police to enforce them. The pilot schools that we chose gave us a range of layouts to learn from, because the road network varies so significantly from school to school. And that also meant a variety of outcomes in the pilots. So we didn't get full removal of traffic. Of course, some of that is due to resident permits, and they have access to the zone and are able to move at all times. But we did see a reduction at every location during our random traffic surveys. So a couple of examples. Before and after the zones, we saw vehicle numbers drop from 74 to 13 at one school drop-off, 20 to 0 at another school, and 45 vehicles down to 4 at another. We haven't had the clear run of an 18-month pilot that we'd hoped for. Lockdown got in the way, and the school closures, of course. But nonetheless, this was enough evidence for us to move forward and retain all 6 schools. And those 6 pilots are now being made permanent, which feels like a really significant milestone for the project. But at the same time, we were being overtaken by events. We knew that as schools returned in August 2020, we would have to react to enable social distancing at school gates and to create as safe an environment as possible for those who were using active travel to get to school. By October, we had a further 20 schools rolled out under the temporary COVID-related Spaces for People project. Again, with these schools, we're mostly relying on compliance by drivers, which has been a success. So as part of phase 2, we've brought together a range of stakeholders to form a steering group that will develop closer partnership working and identify how we can all make these zones as successful as possible. I suspect that at some point we'll need to consider enhanced measures that can limit access to vehicles. As the schemes mature and we identify where compliance isn't as it should be, I think different schools may need different solutions here. But I'm really keen that we learn from other local authorities across the UK that have brought them in using different models. And the Spaces for People project enabled us to look at wider neighbourhood interventions as well. So these zones are not the only school street improvements that we've brought in. So in Denniston in the East End, we've widened footways, we've reduced the carriageway using planters, and that's made more space out to primary schools. In Pollokshields, we're closing a street outside a primary school completely to prevent any traffic other than people moving through active travel. A Southside secondary school will benefit from widened footways as a temporary measure. And the closure of Kelvin Way in East End has offered a far more pleasant and traffic-free route to Hillhead Primary, in addition to their existing car-free zone. And that is in particular one of the Spaces for People interventions that I think has been very much welcomed and adopted by the local community. And it's certainly clear from my inbox that parents and school communities want us to intervene to tackle unnecessary traffic. Often it's a minority of parents who are driving to school who are creating the issues for so many of the others in the school community. But as I said earlier, it's not been the easiest time to make changes. The Spaces for People project did not allow for any consultation before implementation. But in the longer term, we need to do this work alongside the communities that it affects. So our evaluation will seek opinions from residents as well as parents and help us iron out any issues before we make schemes permanent wherever possible. And as we begin to return to something closer to business as usual, I hope we will be able to use school streets as the beginning of a conversation. It's great having the last 200 metres of the journey to school in real safety, but what about the rest of that journey? With children and young people so engaged in the climate crisis and understanding that there's a need to change our lifestyles, I think we have a great opportunity to make school streets the centre of a far more ambitious, wide-reaching change to all neighbourhoods, with the needs of our smallest citizens at the heart of that work. Our Livable Neighbourhoods work, which is currently in development, will enable us to do just that. This strategy seeks to improve neighbourhoods. It'll focus on local high streets, active travel, everyday journeys, and creating streets that are for people. And school car-free zones may be one of a range of interventions that we can implement to help achieve these aims. The potential to design communities that work for the youngest of residents is huge and exciting. It certainly feels as we've come a long way in a few short years, but we really are at the very beginning of what is possible. and I'll leave it there.
Sorry, Mary, you're on mute at the moment.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I've muted myself accidentally. Sorry. I just wanted to say thank you very much, Anna, for that fascinating topic. We are very excited about the COP26 summit in Glasgow, and our WOW badge competition has just launched. It's open to schools nationwide, and I do hope some of the schools that you've been working with will be entering and getting some with the chance to potentially win some free resources from Living Streets to help with their brilliant work. You're absolutely right to talk about the excitement of putting our smallest citizens at the heart of everything we do. And I think it's really, really important that we get the message out loud and clear that streets that are good for children are streets that are good for everybody. We're going to move on now to our next speaker. It's a video from Janet McDonald from Moray Council. Janet is the Sustainable Travel Officer for Moray in the northeast of Scotland. In her work, she has supported schools and works across the wider transport sector to encourage sustainable travel. Moray Council have worked with Living Streets to promote walking to school for many years, have some of the highest rates of active travel in Scotland. They've just begun to introduce school streets closures at key locations to encourage more walking and cycling and to promote more inclusive environments outside some of their busiest schools. So we'll look at Janet's video now.
So hi, my name's Janet McDonald and I am the Sustainable Travel Officer for Moray Council. Moray Council decided to do school streets based on road safety concerns that had been highlighted by a number of schools in Moray. It had been ongoing for some time. We had measures already in place around these schools that had highlighted their concerns, such as zigzags, double yellows. We had school penalties, speed bumps and other kind of behaviour change initiatives that had been tried and tested, but we were still seeing the same, if not more, levels of safety concerns being addressed by the school and residents also of the area. So we felt it was time to take it a step further and look at potentially closing the streets. So the first step we took for school streets was, in order to make it fair, we offered the scheme out to every primary school and we have 45. We explained the scheme and we then let them register interest with us. So we had 6 schools reply with their interest in taking part in the scheme. We had the 6, and then what we looked at was the kind of selection process. So we did a number of site assessments at the school. We looked at the actual road layout, the road network, whether there was capacity for signage at footways. We also looked to see whether there was proven positive support from the schools, and that they would continue to work with Moray Council throughout the initiative in promoting the school street scheme. We also looked at whether they were currently engaged in any form of active travel, or school travel planning, any cycling and walking initiatives, to ensure that they were fully on board with what we were doing and the message we wanted to kind of get across. So what we did next, once we selected 2 schools to take forward, and those 2 schools were actually our biggest schools within Elgin. That had, like I mentioned, road safety concerns and had really been trying to address the problem themselves for a while. So the next step, once those 2 were selected, were to engage with Police Scotland to ensure we had their backing and support for this scheme. From there, we started working with the schools on how to promote the message with the parents, and to let them know this was coming, what it would mean for them, what it would mean for the pupils. And we also engaged, and this was really quite important, with the residents of the school streets. Having the support of the residents is key, I would say. explaining why we're doing it, how it will affect them, and that there is obviously exemptions and residents can apply for residence permits. So these steps were really key in getting the key stakeholders involved, so Police Scotland, the residents and the schools, and we were working out how we were going to do this. From that we started looking at signage, what we would use. We had a number of different types of signs we could use at the schools. We decided to go with flashing signs. We felt it was more visible for the public, so whilst parents and residents might be aware that those streets were closed, for the public also wanted to make it really visible and highly clear that during those times, once the lights flash, you cannot come through those streets. So yeah, it was selecting signage, the procurement process of it all, and yeah, getting that in place all ready for the scheme to start. So once that was all in place, our next step to actually launch the scheme was to get our experimental traffic regulation order in place. We set ours for a period of 9 months. This process, we will monitor and assess the scheme as it goes on. We encourage feedback throughout that 9 months from the public, from residents, from the school, but for formal objections for the scheme, we do require that to be within the first 6 months of the process. So once that ETRO was then in place, it was a case of getting as much social media promotion out there and recognition, working with the local media, our Moray Council social media pages, the school's Twitter and social media, and of course the police were really vital in sharing it on their Facebooks, on their Twitter. So that's what we did, and then we had our launch day where we had Living Streets support us, along with Strider, and the police were here for the first full week at both schools, just educating drivers on what they can and can't do. So as to take further down the line, they're aware that they can't come into the school streets during pick-up and drop-off times. So the lessons learned, I mean, we are very early into the scheme starting. This is into its third week. So we still have a lot more to find out about it, but I think giving it time is key. But also selecting schools that understand fully the message, the reason behind it, and that they can get behind you in supporting it long term. This isn't, a one-day trial. This is ongoing, and you do need a school that understands road safety and the importance of active travel and the reduction of congestion at the school gates. I think that what's key to the work that you need to put in place prior to the scheme starting is that I would not underestimate it. There is a lot of work involved, but given that we now have the scheme in place, I would say it's absolutely worth it. Some of the comments and feedback we've had from parents, from residents, and from the school themselves has made all the work behind the scenes really worth it. So thank you very much for listening to my story about the school streets in Moray. We hope long term it's going to be a huge success, and if we can do it, we hope that you can too.
Fantastic learning and storytelling there from colleagues at Moray Council, from Janet. Just a reminder, if you do want to submit a question to one of our speakers, you can ask in the chat box at the bottom right hand side. We are getting some questions, and we may be able also to bring you in live. So put your hand up if you'd like to come in and ask a live question. We're going to turn now to our final speaker. We are going to hear from Professor Alison Stenning, who co-runs Playmeet Street North Tyneside. It promotes and coordinates temporary residential road closures for play across North Tyneside and supports one of the most active play street schemes in the UK, involving more than 60 local streets. Alison has been doing this since 2017. She also helps to coordinate Living Streets North Tyneside, which was launched in summer last year in the context of the reallocation of road space across the borough. Alison is an academic geographer, and her primary research focus explores play on streets, something that I remember from my childhood, and the ways in which play can transform our relationships with our streets and our neighbours of ages. Alison, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I will now try and share my screen. So this is what happened. Just give me 1 second. Right. Is that all okay for everyone? I'm assuming it is.
Yeah, good to go.
Brilliant, thank you. So as Mary suggested, I kind of sort of have three hats on, which kind of connect in different ways to the ideas around kind of thinking about children play in streets. My brief talk today, I'm going to start with a bit of kind of context, which links very much to some of the stories that Lee introduced, some of the ideas that Lee introduced right at the beginning of today's session, and then talking a bit more kind of concrete detail about what we've done North Tyneside, both through Play Meets Street, but also briefly how that links through to kind of our activities as Living Streets North Tyneside, and how all of these things are connected. Some of you may have seen this article in The Guardian yesterday about a piece of research carried out by Helen Dodd at Reading University and her colleagues, reporting that UK children are not allowed to play outside until 2 years older than their parents' generation. So recording that most children are not playing out, not being allowed to play out without parents until they've turned 11. Interestingly, Scotland was coming out kind of much better on all of the measures that Helen Dodd and her colleagues recorded, with children being able to play out earlier and their independent mobility much higher. And Helen Dodd and her colleagues picked up on a whole variety of different kind of factors which kind of shaped children's ability to play outside, but also their impacts on their independent mobility, whether walking, cycling, scooting, or what else. Picks up a whole variety of different factors, but one of the things that was most interesting to me, and was mentioned kind of incidentally in the report, but is apparently kind of going to be a focus of kind of further work, is the need to consider specific features of children's environments at very local levels when trying to explain why our children have less access to their neighbourhood space to play in, to be independently mobile, to be without adults. And of course, this is especially important for those without private gardens, who don't have private outdoor space in which to play. Even for those with private outdoor gardens, playing outside on the street in the neighbourhood is a very different experience to playing at home, either with friends, siblings, or on your own. And years of play work research and activism suggests that children want to play on their streets. They want to play with other children. They want to play in spaces that are familiar and extremely local to them. Children like playgrounds, they like parks, they like soft play centres, of course, but often if you ask children, they'll opt to choose to play on their streets if they're allowed, and if it feels safe to do so. When children do play on their streets, when we create the space for children to play on their streets, and we do this in a whole variety of ways, and I think it's worth thinking about various mentions today about what happened on streets during particularly the first lockdown. And I've done some research on this, which I'm not really going to talk about today. But what became clear during the first lockdown across the UK and elsewhere was what was possible on streets when we removed cars, when parents were present, when children weren't at school. And suddenly we kind of saw this kind of reanimation of streets and children quite freely playing. So a very clear sense that if you give children the space to play on their streets and in their neighbourhoods, they will take it, and they'll take all sorts of creative and diverse ways. So when children are on their streets, their mobilities are much more kind of haphazard, non-linear, unruly than we might predict, or we might expect, or we might talk about when we're talking particularly about adult mobilities. Those of you with children, those of you that spend time with children will know this from moving around your neighbourhoods and your towns and your cities, that moving with children often means moving much more slowly and much more unpredictably. Children scoot, chase, explore, wheel, stop and start, crawl, jump, kick balls, climb on walls, lie on the pavement, start to play games, veer around in different directions, meander, and so on. They don't often just walk up the road or up the pavements. They cross the road, they talk along and across the road, they play along the road, they move into the road, they cycle and scoot around the road. And obviously, I'm talking particularly here about instances when the road is open to children to play, but we know that that's how children move up pavements as well. So things like pavement parking, pavement clutter, but also an idea of having shared space, whether that's kind of cycling and walking or other kinds of modalities, makes it much more difficult to manage children's kind of unruly, kind of non-linear mobility, which we don't want to stop. So we have to think about then what the challenges are for particular forms of mobility and kind of children's movement. And there's quite a good diagram here. This was produced in the Netherlands. It's obviously the way for A to B, and at the bottom the caption is the street is also there for children. And so you can see, and obviously this is in a kind of idyllic kind of Dutch kind of context where children are free to move in this way, in these kinds of spaces that Lee was talking about earlier in the Netherlands, in part of Germany, in parts of Denmark, for example. But you can see this small girl moving around the street in an extremely non-linear way. She's not just crossing the street. She's not moving up and down the street. She's moving around the street, up and down bits of street furniture, around and round in circles, moving between and within cars and individuals and people and adults and other kinds of spaces on the street. And so imagining this kind of mobility, which is how children want to move around their streets, challenges us to think about how we use streets and how we use pavements from kind of the eyes of the child, if you like. And this is important for a whole variety of different ways, but it's important because this is what children need, particularly in a context in which they've had far less access to outdoor spaces, to their friends, their family, and so on over the last year, but also because we've seen this kind of continual lockdown of children's lives over the last 30 or 40 years. But we know from decades of research that when children and adults are able to connect playfully with their streets, they feel like they belong to them, but they also start to take responsibility for them. And they're much more likely, children who grow up with a connection to their streets are much more likely to make commitments to their communities of other kinds as they grow up, to notice and care for their natural environments, but also their urban environments, their street environments, to have an investment and a connection to these places. So this all kind of connects then to the Playing Out movement, which I've been involved in personally since 2015. And thinking about kind of in terms of both activism and research since about 2017. Some of you will know some of this history, and I'm not going to kind of go over it in too much detail. But the Playing Out movement started in 2009 with two mothers in Bristol who wanted to enable their children to have the access to their street to play that they'd had growing up. In that kind of 11 years now, the movement has grown well beyond Bristol. It's now an international movement. But nationally, within the UK, we see more than 80 local authorities with street play or playing out policies, and over 1,000 streets involved over the last kind of 11 years. And these are often referred to either as street play streets, or playing out sessions, short, regular licenses, stewarded road closures, creating a safe space for neighbours to meet and play. And there are lots of examples of this happening in Scotland. I know Edinburgh had a play street scheme in place. Certainly until recently. I'm not sure if it's still active, but this kind of scheme was acknowledged, the value of it acknowledged by the Minister for Transport in London in 2019, who argued that play streets offer wonderful opportunities not merely for children but for families and communities. And in North Tyneside, we actually, Playing Out started in North Tyneside in 2015 as part of a pilot project run by another organisation. But we created Playmeet Street in North Tyneside as a constituted community group to take over that pilot project. And we've built the number of streets playing out in North Tyneside from about 10 in 2017 to over 60 now. About 35 of those play out regularly, obviously when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. And when we've seen a flurry, we haven't restarted yet. We're hoping that we're going to be able to restart on May the 17th, but we're waiting for confirmation from the council. But we've seen a flurry of interest. I think we've had about 25 more applications in the last 2 weeks. So there's an ever-growing kind of demand, an ever-growing desire for people to do this on their streets. We run Playmeet Street North Tyneside as a voluntary group. There's a few of us who are here and run the organisation. We've had pots of funding from the lottery, for example, and we work very closely with the council, but we kind of administer and process. We act as a go-between, I suppose, between residents and the council to make sure that this is a process that's as easy as possible for residents and is also free for residents to engage in. We're building also in North Tyneside on a history of historic play streets, and it was really interesting to see Stuart's slide of that kind of street playground from Leith in the 1960s. He had about 30 street playgrounds in North Tyneside, or Tynemouth Borough Council as it was at the time, through the 1940s, 50s and 60s. And so trying to think about kind of the legacy of earlier attempts to make streets safe for children is something that's quite interesting to think about. And we very much see this action within Playmate Street North Tyneside as connecting to other programmes like school streets and thinking forward to things like low traffic neighbourhoods. So there's a clear connection between playing out the active travel agenda more widely. So in a 2017 survey, Playing Out in Bristol recorded that the majority reported that children had learned or improved skills such as riding a bike or scooting on their street. This is my street with a pack of children cycling down it. Street closures often create an appetite for quieter streets, so people start to talk about filtering, they start to talk about speed limits, they start to talk about the number of parked cars on their streets, for example. So we see these conversations arising about what streets are for, how we might prioritise different kinds of people moving in different ways on streets. And we also see evidence that neighbours engage in other forms of activism, including things like walking, cycling and better streets campaigns. And as I've already suggested, we can start to think about how streets might be connected to school streets to start to create broader low traffic neighbourhoods. And I guess this connection between kind of forms of activism around play streets building into kind of wider walking, cycling and better streets campaigns is probably how I ended. Oh, sorry, I'd forgotten I'd added that slide. So this is part of kind of what some of you will have seen the green road open to sign that appeared on many of the low traffic neighbourhoods across London in particular, but also elsewhere during the end of last year. And we've worked with Brightways to create one that is specifically for play streets. So we have children kind of engaging in all sorts of kinds of play and all sorts of different kinds of mobility here, but also an adult with a cup of tea or coffee. And we're going to use this sign when we restart Playing Out in the next few weeks to spark a conversation again about what streets are for, that roads aren't closed when children are playing on them, but they're in fact open for more people and more activities, and particularly for children. So, and it's our kinds of debates and activism then that I got involved in Living Streets North Tyneside, which we kind of reformed last year. There was a Living Streets Tyneside branch that was kind of had been dormant for a while, which covered both Newcastle and North Tyneside. We kind of reformed or created Living Streets North Tyneside last year in the context of some of the changes that had been going on around COVID and the reallocation of street space. And some of you may have seen some of this on social media. The council implemented a 3-mile long cycleway from Tynemouth to Whitley Bay, right along our glorious seafront. It already forms part of NCN1, but it's a shared path in ordinary times. And they created this fantastic cycleway, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about it, but what's really interesting is that obviously and understandably it was extremely popular with families. So we saw an awful lot of children and families. We saw cargo bikes and tandems and trailers being used on the road, which could simply not have been used on the shared path. It would have been impossible for that volume of children and their families, but also those different kinds of mobility and those different kinds of bikes on a shared path, which obviously in itself was heaving with pedestrians during the summer months last year. But what we also saw was one of our local organisations, Bike for Health, who basically run cycle training and event schemes with schools, routinely using the cycleway to take out whole classes from our local primaries. And there's a couple of pictures here, photos from Michael Halliday, who works with Bike for Health. But we also saw the pedestrianisation of a high street, 2 high streets, in fact, in North Tyneside. And those two became very popular spaces with children and young people. And there have been mentions today about the different kind of ages. But obviously, talking about kind of primary age children and talking about secondary age children is very different in terms of their needs, in terms of street space and how they move about. So we saw some pedestrianisations on high streets, and this kind of scene here with the kids on skateboards was very familiar, whilst parents mooched and mingled and shopped, bought coffees and cakes, for example, looked in and browsed in the shops. Children and young people were often kind of hanging out skateboards and stuff down the pedestrianised high street. So creating another kind of space for play and a way for children and adults to use a pedestrianised space kind of together, but in different ways. So we very much kind of, as we've launched Living Streets North Tyneside, the children and young people and their mobilities, their very different mobilities, has been the heart of most of our activities. And this is kind of a key feature of what we're trying to kind of work with and think about over the next few months. And we've been very lucky that North Tyneside has launched a School Streets programme too. Was the first to do so in the North East, although Newcastle has now also done that. So I will finish there. I've left a few slides, a few comments, a few links here, which link both to my kind of the activist work, but also to some of my academic work connects to all of this. And I now need to go back. All right, I have stopped sharing already. Thank you.
Alison, thank you so much for that. It was absolutely fascinating to hear. It's great to hear what the group is doing in North Tyneside. It's wonderful to Cycleway Open, and I loved your description about children moving in a non-linear fashion. I think when I tweeted recently, I said there's a lot of children mucking about in my low traffic neighbourhood, and that's exactly what they should be doing, mucking out. Runners racing cyclists and having the freedom and the confidence to allow those races to take place and to do their chalking and to chalk Happy Easter out on the pavements. These are all lovely things to see. We do have a couple of questions and comments in the chat, so I'm just going to go through them now. And I do encourage anybody who wants to ask a question, do please raise your hand or submit it in the questions. So first of all, we have a comment from Jenny Wiles. Really like the idea of Play Streets. Jenny is our regional director for the north of England. Play Streets is the gateway to looking at other measures like school streets and low traffic neighbourhoods, talking about streets that are safe for children to play out rather than streets that are closed to traffic. So it's about the kind of re-engineering, if you like, of the language. And I call this the sort of Trojan horse. You know, once you've got a play street or a school street, you're immediately building that community for change and saying there's a different way of doing things. Have you got any thoughts on how else we can build those communities and amplify their voices, particularly on social media?
The voices of
those communities for change, the silent majority in favour of calmer traffic.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think, you know, if it's something, it's very difficult kind of to really complain about play streets. Although I think it's interesting, actually, what I think one of the things that's kind of struck me over the last kind of few months is, you know, a lot of the sort of low traffic neighbourhoods activists post pictures of kids playing on streets, and there's quite often a response which is like, oh, right, yeah, so my journey to work has to be slower because the kids want to play out, you know, like why should, you know, and so I think there is a real issue here about kind of like, I think part of it is about kind of reinforcing and restating kind of how valuable play is on doorsteps to children. And we often obviously get saying, well, why can't they just play at the park? You know, what's wrong with children playing at the park? And I think there is a need to kind of reiterate that kind of that the value of children playing on their streets and why it's so critically important to them. And not only that they would choose it, but it builds so much in terms of kind of children's orientations to the world and how they kind of connect to their communities. And I mean, you know, it's probably, you know, pushing it too far to say it builds children who will be, you know, kind of activists and engaged in the future, but it's probably, you know, that's probably kind of a big part of it, and that having a kind of an appreciation of their kind of local environments. But I think there is an issue, I think, around you know, yeah, the debate around kind of children's play taking priority over other kinds of activities. So I think there's a sort of, that's not really an answer to your question, but I think that a concerning issue, I think, in terms of kind of promoting these only as spaces kind of for children's play. And I think one of the other ways that we've talked about what happens on play streets is how it brings in the whole range of kind of the community, you know. So I did some work on loneliness and playing out and looked at the way in which, you know, if you close the streets to through traffic, you know, you get all sorts of other kind of connections that emerge otherwise, you know. So adults with or without children will come out on the street, will sit around, will join in, will share stories, play in their childhoods often. So that there are all sorts of other kind of connections. It's not just about play, it's about animating and connecting a community. And maybe that's another kind of narrative that can be kind of put in there.
Absolutely, and I know from my own street, which is a play street, sadly has not been a play street for the last year because of COVID. It's not just the children having a little cricket match; it's the parents all having a chat and getting out. And what wouldn't we give at the moment with the lockdown to have had the chance to come out and stand safely with our friends and neighbours over a coffee? And one of the chalking things that really stuck in my head was some children had chalked a circle, a COVID-safe circle, outside their school gate so that their friends could come and stand at the school, and they could stand at the other side of the circle and they could be together. And I put it on Twitter and someone said, oh, Ring a Roses, this is the modern version of Ring a Roses. So the really interesting, things about what you catch when you're close to people. And I thought it was kind of both inspirational but also quite tragic to see that. But kids will find a way to be with their friends. They will overcome anything, and COVID isn't going to stop them. Anna, have you got any thoughts on school streets as the Trojan horse to wider conversations in communities about allocating road space, slower speeds, getting the community out?
Yeah, I think as I was saying in my own presentation, the thing that's really exciting about school streets is that the vast majority of people are for them. When we saw the press coverage that we got, instant people were for them, because most people were coming to us and saying it's a tiny majority. It's the same handful of cars that come down, but a handful of cars is enough to change the environment in that street. So what we've seen at some of the school streets we've brought in, that parents just organically start to use the carriageway. They just start to stand in the road. I think because we're all 2 meters apart through muscle memory these days, so we naturally do that and we take up more space. But it happened very quickly. That does then create some conflict because we have situations whereby some cars are coming through it, and that's difficult. We need to resolve that. I think that's about, as Janet was saying, taking time, letting things bed in. But certainly it shows us how quickly we can start to see a street take shape in a different fashion and for different uses. And I think that should be confidence when we then have conversations with the wider community about, do we want to turn this into a different type of neighbourhood? Do we want to look at modal filtering rather than simply traffic calming? Do we want to look at reallocating some of the space that is used for parking at the moment for other uses, whether that's bike shelters, for example, whether that's parklets, whether that's just different uses of that space? And we can go to them and say, look, we tried something and it's made a change on this street. We can actually make those changes happen more widely, and it's not frightening, and actually to see on the ground something very positive quite quickly, rather than perhaps all the worries and concerns of what we're taking away. So it's a really nice way to have a very focused conversation, I think, and then to start to talk about how we roll those benefits out more widely.
Absolutely, and I think there's a distinction between the real space which people live in and the social media space, which can often be hijacked, sometimes by machine bots. I think there was a consultation, I think Newcastle, somewhere I think it was the north, where the consultation was hijacked by troll accounts, and so that it was invalid. But it was basically, if a Twitter account has done 75,000 tweets and it's only been going for a year, you can be pretty certain that it's not a person doing that if you do the maths. So I have a bit of experience of trolling. So I just think making people aware. People tend to overestimate opposition and underestimate support, and I think it's critical that we give voice to the silent majority. We also now have a question from Stuart Macmillan, Vice Chair of National Federation for the Blind UK, west of Scotland, who says to Alison, do you have controls in the street? An older child riding fast on a bike or e-scooter in a play street has a power dynamic over somebody wanting to sit down and play with chalk. Any separation by age?
No, but you're right. These are conflicts that in some ways do kind of emerge on the street, and we tend to kind of manage them. I mean, speaking from the experience of kind of my own street, you're right. I mean, there have been moments where you think that the kids that are having scooter races up and down the middle of the street are going to kind of knock over a toddler, but they manage. Obviously, parents are there. They're not particularly kind of interfering, but they're keeping an eye on what's going on. And I mean, I think we've had one minor accident in 6 years of playing out on my street. But you know, it's quite I think another probably quite useful lesson for the children to learn is that they have to share this space. And you know, if they're 9 and they want to race up and down on their scooter, they can do so, but they do need to kind of take care of the fact that, you know, we've had children who have literally learned to walk on our street because they've grown up on our street since it's been playing out. And you know, so there are quite often, I mean, I think in some of the slides that I showed, there were children crawling on the street. And so there is a kind of negotiation and a navigation of that has to kind of go on. But I suppose what happens when they have the whole street rather than just the pavements is that there is space for that to be navigated and negotiated, and for there to be a kind of judgment about which bit of the street, you know, is scooter space and which bit is kind of chalking space. And, you know, and they often happen together. You know, we have children sitting on scooters and chalking, for example. And, you know, and like I say, the parents or carers are always there, but not necessarily kind of sort of interfering. They're just sort of there to kind of manage the space, I suppose, to make sure that the space is safe. And that does include, you know, if there are some slightly overzealous scooter children, then they need to be kind of reined in a little bit. But like I say, the children manage it, and we've, like I say, we had one minor incident, I think, in 6 years of playing out. But it's an issue, and I think we're aware of it, but the children seem to manage it quite well themselves.
I think in my street, the lesson was that you have to get the cricket bats off the dads. So it becomes a dad play street, you know. So there was, you know, any chance to hold the bat. We've got a question from Cynthia Games from Living Streets to both speakers. I'll come to you first, Anna. Many schools in the northeast of England and near the Scottish borders, I'm sure this is the case in Glasgow as well, were designed as car entry at the main entrance and school pupil entry at the secondary entrance. How can we change and mitigate this? This is the, you know, make way for the car at the school gates. Have you any thoughts on that? Is that an issue in Glasgow, Anna?
We've got a real mix across our school estate, from brand new builds, from, you know, things that are a couple of decades old to our sort of Victorian school estate as well, all very mixed, and again with a mix in terms of whether there is car parking for teachers and staff or not. I think this raises that wider issue of how we manage those conflicts, because where you put in a school street, essentially the residents do benefit because they can still get access. They have access at all times in our scheme, but they have fewer other cars to navigate around. So that's a positive thing. Where we have a potential conflict is where you're looking at teaching and school staff, and they're perhaps having to either arrive earlier to get through before the controls begin, or think about parking differently. So that is certainly a challenge, but it's what we have to confront one way or another, where we have residential parking zones more widely, not just for school times, but all times. Some of those do capture schools, which mean that teachers may then have to pay to park on the street outside a school that previously they'd been able to park fine outside it. And we have had to navigate that and work with the education department on that. So I think it's a wider conversation we have, not just about necessarily school car parks themselves, but about those people who work in our school estates and how they're travelling to those schools, and how we make that manageable for them, and how we make sure that they do have good transport offerings that perhaps mean that they don't have to rely on their own cars so often. But I think that's just an example of the wider issue that we need to tackle everyone's commutes and make them accessible, just those that work in the city centre. We have lots of people that work in Glasgow, around Glasgow, come in and out, not necessarily in that traditional into the centre travel plan. So we need to be looking at that, and schools, because they're within our communities, we really need to be tackling that across the whole school.
There's something there, isn't there, about the working patterns of predominantly female teachers in primary schools, and they may be going from suburb to suburb, live in a suburb and they're working in a suburb, versus the traditional office commuter patterns of men, which is the transport system designed to bus here, drop you into town. There's nothing that goes orbitally. It all goes radially. And I think there's some interesting work happening around women's travel patterns in particular. Alison, final thoughts from you, just on the research, the antiquated design of the North Tyneside Roads network, and this issue about schools and gateways.
Yeah, I know Cynthia is less than a mile from me, and in another part of North Tyneside, and I'm kind of aware of sort of layout of her neighbourhood. And I think it's been interesting. You know, we've got four school streets that have been launched by the council here over the last kind of few months, and the experiences there I think are quite different, because they depend so much on where the school is located, and that micro level stuff around, You know, is it a cul-de-sac? You know, is it just off a main road? Is it, you know, is it an access point to kind of other parts of estates and communities? And I think, you know, obviously what we see with the school street is the kind of the subverting of that priority, that suddenly the main entrance, which has been designated as a car entry, becomes a pedestrian entry. And there are knock-on impacts of that. And I think one of the school streets in particular in North Tyneside is struggling quite a lot with, you know, where then parents are parking their cars. And I suppose that's the thing. It's like, you know, I mean, so much of the focus obviously is on kind of children getting to school, which is essential. But an awful lot of that work has to be done with parents. And, you know, there's clearly follow through from what happens in school and things like the WOW programme, but you know, how we then also think about kind of parental kind of access to school, but as you said, also staff access. And I think there was a bit of the discussion earlier which focused on the impacts of people kind of working from home, and how, you know, and obviously in some senses that's given some of us more time to take, you know, to walk to school or scoot to school or cycle to school, but that's very unequal. And we know that, you know, that there are vast kind of cohort parents who have not been able to work from home over the last year, and those tend to be, you know, those in poorer communities and in worse paid jobs, often, you know, on very kind of strict timescales, have to be at work at a certain time. So, you know, there's still a pressure on them to drop their kids and get to school. And I think, you know, so I think we do need to think about some of the inequalities in terms of the space that has been, the time that's been created through the kind of working from home. And I think, you know, but I think that issue about kind of how that building walking and cycling networks for commuting that reflect different patterns, and as you say, gendered patterns often. I think, you know, in North Tyneside, you know, we're a town of many centres, and it's almost impossible to get between, say, North Shields and Whitley Bay safely. You know, so if you were living in North Shields and working in Whitley Bay, whether you're a teacher or someone else, it's much more difficult to do that than get into Newcastle, for example, where there is a direct traffic-free cycle route. You wouldn't want to walk to Newcastle, but you could try. But yeah.
You're on.
Sorry, Mary, you're on.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I've got different mute buttons. Thank you. That's all we have time for. So thanks to Alison, to Anna, and to our colleague from Janet McDonald from Moray Council as well, for their brilliant presentations through some of these issues. Well done. The claps are coming thick and fast, digital claps. And we're going to hand the floor now back to Stuart for some closing remarks.